13 Colonies, From Settlement to Society, 1607 to 1754. American-style historical narration script, detailed, historically grounded. If you want to understand how the United States was made, you don't start in 1776. You start earlier, when America wasn't a country, and the Atlantic Ocean wasn't a bridge, but a brutal boundary that could swallow ships, fortunes, and entire lives. Between 1607 and 1754, England's scattered coastal footholds on the eastern edge of North America grew into a chain of colonies. Over time, those colonies stopped being fragile outposts and began acting like a society, an economy, a political culture, and a way of life that was no longer fully English, but not yet American. By 1754, the colonies were still part of the British Empire, still loyal in many ways, still divided by region and interest. But they had learned something powerful: how to govern themselves locally, how to build wealth from land and trade, and how to argue endlessly about rights, authority, and identity. This is the story of the 13 colonies becoming something real. Jamestown, survival, tobacco, and the shape of the Chesapeake, 1607 to 1650s. In 1607, the Virginia Company sent an expedition into the Chesapeake and found Jamestown on the James River. It was England's first permanent settlement in North America. The location was chosen with security in mind. It could be defended from potential Spanish attack, but it was a terrible place to keep people alive. The water was brackish and often contaminated. Mosquitoes bred in the marshes. Disease, especially malaria and dysentery, spread quickly. Food supplies were uncertain. Many colonists were not farmers. Some expected quick riches, not years of hardship. Jamestown survived only through painful trial and error, and through a relationship, often tense, often unstable, with native peoples in the region, especially the Powhatan Confederacy. Powhatan society was not a loose collection of isolated villages. It was a political network held together by leadership, diplomacy, tribute relationships, and local authority. For English settlers, survival depended on securing food and learning the land. For the Powhatan, the English were a disruptive new presence that could be traded with, pressured, tolerated, or expelled, depending on circumstances. The early years were desperate. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became known as the starving time. Dozens upon dozens died. The colony's future looked uncertain, and violence between colonists and native communities flared repeatedly. Over the next decades, conflict would return again and again, including major Powhatan-led assaults in 1622 and 1644 that killed large numbers of colonists and intensified brutal retaliations and land seizure. Virginia eventually found an export crop that changed everything: tobacco. Tobacco cultivation expanded rapidly in the 1610s and 1620s, especially after John Rolfe helped establish varieties and markets that English consumers wanted. Tobacco required intense labor and constant access to new land because it exhausted the soil. As tobacco profits rose, settlers expanded outward, pushing deeper into native territory. The crop didn't just build the economy, it shaped society. Scattered plantations along rivers, a focus on export markets, and a constant pressure for land that fed conflict. Labor became the central problem. Early Virginia relied heavily on indentured servants, men and women, often poor or unemployed in England, who traded years of labor for passage across the Atlantic. For some, indenture offered a path toward land and independence after service ended. For many others, it meant disease, brutal work, and death before freedom ever arrived. As the colony matured, elites sought a more permanent and controllable labor force. In 1619, two developments foreshadowed the colony's future. The first was political. The House of Burgesses met for the first time, creating an elected assembly. It was limited. Political power remained restricted to property-holding men, but it established a lasting precedent. Colonists expected a voice in local laws and taxation. The second was social and economic. A group of Africans arrived in Virginia. In the earliest years, their status could vary. But across the 17th century, the Chesapeake colonies moved steadily toward racialized, hereditary slavery. By the early 1700s, slavery was deeply embedded in the economy and law, and it helped define the social hierarchy of the South. New England would look very different, but both regions were developing a habit that mattered: local institutions, local decisions, and local identity. Plymouth and Massachusetts: community, covenant, and conflict. 1620s to 1670s. In 1620, the Pilgrims, English separatists seeking religious autonomy, arrived and founded Plymouth Colony. Their numbers were small, and Plymouth never became the richest or most powerful colony, but it became important in American memory because it represented a different logic of settlement: community and covenant, not just profit. The Mayflower Compact, signed aboard ship, was a simple agreement to form a political community and make decisions for the common good. It wasn't modern democracy, but it was an early example of colonists organizing their own governance. In 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony began a much larger migration, often called the Great Migration. Puritans arrived aiming to build a godly society, what they saw as a moral community that could serve as an example. Towns formed around meeting houses and churches. New England's economy mixed small farming, fishing, lumber, and commerce. Unlike the scattered plantations of Virginia, New England developed tighter towns with more compact settlement patterns. Education became a priority, partly because literacy supported religious life. Harvard College was founded in 1636 to train ministers and leaders. New England also developed town meetings and local decision-making, encouraging a political culture of participation among eligible men. But Puritan unity didn't last. Dissent appeared early. Roger Williams argued for religious freedom and separation of church and state. He was banished and founded Rhode Island, which became known for broader tolerance. Anne Hutchinson challenged religious authorities and was also expelled, revealing how fragile uniformity could be when power and belief collided. Connecticut grew as settlers moved outward from Massachusetts, while New Hampshire developed to the north. New England was never a single story. It was a family of colonies with related origins but different trajectories. Relations with native peoples in New England were also shaped by expansion and war. The Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, and King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, were catastrophic conflicts that reshaped the region. King Philip's War, in particular, was one of the most destructive wars in colonial North American history relative to population. Towns burned, communities were shattered, and native nations faced devastating losses and displacement. The conflict also revealed a recurring colonial pattern. Expansion produced conflict. Conflict produced more militarization, and militarization justified further expansion. The Middle Colonies: diversity, commerce, and the breadbasket. 1660s to early 1700s. If New England was shaped by towns and faith, and the Chesapeake by plantations and tobacco, the Middle Colonies became a crossroads. They were defined by diversity, commerce, and trade. In the early 1600s, the Dutch established New Netherland, centered on New Amsterdam at the mouth of the Hudson River. The colony focused on trade and river commerce. In 1664, England seized New Netherland and renamed it New York. The empire changed, but the diversity remained. New York became a place where different languages, religions, and customs mixed: Dutch, English, German, African, and more. New Jersey emerged next, first divided into East and West Jersey, and later unified as a royal colony in 1702. Pennsylvania was founded in 1681 as a proprietary colony granted to William Penn, shaped by Quaker ideals. Penn promoted religious tolerance and fair dealing, attracting immigrants and investment. Philadelphia grew into a major Atlantic city and one of the most important ports in British America. Delaware, often called the Lower Counties on the Delaware River, was linked to Pennsylvania, but gained its own assembly in 1704, developing a separate political identity even under the same proprietor. Economically, the Middle Colonies became a breadbasket, exporting wheat and grains. Their farms supported both local communities and Atlantic markets. Their population grew through immigration: Germans, Scots-Irish, Dutch, and others, creating cultural pluralism. Compared with the more uniform Puritan towns of New England, the Middle Colonies were often more religiously diverse, more commercially oriented, and more socially fluid. The Southern Colonies: plantations, slavery, and the rise of an elite. 1630s to 1750s. Further south, England's colonies developed around plantation agriculture and the growing institution of slavery. Maryland was founded in 1632 as a proprietary colony associated with Catholic leadership, though it became religiously mixed over time. Like Virginia, Maryland relied heavily on tobacco. The Carolinas began as a proprietary grant in 1663. Over time, North Carolina and South Carolina developed distinct patterns. South Carolina, influenced in part by settlers and commercial connections from Barbados, built an economy around rice and later indigo. Rice cultivation demanded intense labor and specialized knowledge, and the colony imported enslaved Africans in large numbers. Slavery became deeply entrenched in law and daily life. Enslaved Africans were not simply workers. They were treated as property under colonial law. The system was enforced through violence, surveillance, and harsh racial codes. Yet enslaved people resisted in many ways, running away, sabotaging tools, preserving family and culture under oppression, and sometimes openly rebelling. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 was one of the most significant uprisings in colonial British America. It led colonial authorities to tighten restrictions further and to deepen the architecture of control. Georgia, founded in 1732, was the last of the 13 colonies. It began with a different purpose: a place for debtors and the poor, and a buffer against Spanish Florida. Early Georgia policy restricted slavery, but over time economic pressure from neighboring colonies and planters pushed Georgia toward the plantation model. By the mid-18th century, Georgia, too, was drawn into the regional economy, shaped by enslaved labor and export crops. Across the South, wealth and power concentrated among plantation owners who controlled land, labor, and local government. This produced a social hierarchy that looked different from New England's towns and different from the Middle Colony's pluralistic port cities. It was a world where political influence often followed land and labor ownership. Labor systems, indenture, slavery, and the making of a colonial order. Across British America, labor determined everything: who gained wealth, who held power, and whose freedom was protected. Indentured servitude remained important, especially in earlier decades and in certain regions, but over time, slavery expanded dramatically. In the Chesapeake and the Lower South, slavery became central to the export economy. In northern ports, slavery existed as well, tied to households, shipping, and trade. The colonial economy, North and South, was connected to Atlantic systems that included slavery, whether directly through plantations or indirectly through commerce and finance. By the early 1700s, colonial laws increasingly defined slavery as hereditary and racial. That legal transformation created lasting divisions and helped shape the future social structure of what would later become the United States. Native nations, frontiers, and imperial rivalry. The colonies did not grow in a vacuum. The lands Europeans sought were already home to powerful native nations with their own diplomacy, trade networks, and rivalries. Native communities made strategic decisions, forming alliances, negotiating trade, relocating, resisting settlement, or fighting to preserve autonomy. Their choices mattered, and they shaped outcomes. Conflict was frequent. Expansion created friction over land, resources, and political control. Wars were not only local. They were connected to the competition of empires. England and France fought for territory and influence in North America, often forming alliances with native nations. The frontier was not a simple boundary line. It was a contested space where identities, economies, and power were negotiated and fought over again and again. Mercantilism, trade, and the Atlantic economy. By the late 17th century, the colonies were deeply integrated into the Atlantic world. New England developed shipping, fishing, timber, and shipbuilding, trading with the Caribbean and Europe. The Middle Colonies exported grain and built thriving port cities. The South exported tobacco, rice, and indigo, relying heavily on enslaved labor. British officials governed colonial trade through mercantilist policy. Colonies existed to serve the empire's economy. Navigation acts regulated trade to favor British ships and merchants. In practice, colonists often smuggled goods or navigated around restrictions. Still, imperial policy shaped the colonies' economic lives and contributed to political arguments about authority and rights. Politics, local government, and the habit of self-rule. Across the colonies, political life developed through assemblies, town meetings, and local courts. The details varied. New England towns fostered participation among eligible men. Southern colonies were more dominated by land-owning elites. Middle colonies blended proprietary leadership with growing urban influence. But a common pattern emerged. Colonists increasingly expected local control over taxation and internal affairs. Even when they remained loyal to the crown, they formed a habit of self-government, petitioning, voting, debating, and resisting policies they believed threatened local autonomy. In 1735, the trial of John Peter Zenger in New York became famous because it raised questions about press freedom and the ability to criticize government. The legal details were complex, but the cultural impact was lasting. Many colonists embraced the idea that public criticism of officials could be legitimate. Religion and ideas, the Great Awakening and a new public spirit, 1730s to 1740s. In the 1730s and 1740s, a wave of religious revival swept through many colonies, known as the Great Awakening. Preachers emphasized personal conversion, emotional preaching, and a direct relationship with God. The movement did not produce a single political program, but it did challenge established authority, encourage new denominations, and expand the public sphere. It carried a message, sometimes explicit, sometimes implied, that ordinary people could judge leaders by moral standards rather than by inherited status. At the same time, Enlightenment ideas circulated in colonial cities, emphasizing reason, inquiry, and natural rights. These ideas would later shape revolutionary arguments, but even before revolution, they encouraged colonists to think critically about institutions, power, and society. The 13 Colonies by 1754, a society takes shape. By 1754, the colonies were no longer fragile experiments. They were expanding societies with distinct regional identities. New England, town-based life, shipping, education, and tight communities. The Middle Colonies, diversity, commerce, and agricultural wealth. The South, plantations, slavery, and concentrated elite power. Across all regions, population growth was rapid. Ports were busy. Farms spread inland. Frontier communities pushed into contested territory. Colonial assemblies argued with royal officials. Native nations continued to defend land and autonomy under enormous pressure. In 1754, the Albany Congress brought together colonial representatives to discuss cooperation as tensions rose with France and native allies. That year marked the edge of a new era, because the conflict that followed, the French and Indian War, part of a broader global struggle, would reshape the relationship between colonies and empire. But here is the deeper point. By 1754, the 13 colonies had already become a society. Not fully independent, not fully united, but no longer just England overseas. They were becoming something new, a world that would soon demand to speak for itself.